I am Osman. Oh, yes. So the recording is in progress. So yes, before maybe I introduce myself, I should remind you that the meeting will be recording. Actually, the plenary session will be recorded, and we are planning to share it on the Biodiversity Plus website and our YouTube channel. We hope that this is okay for everyone, but the breakout groups, the discussions will not be recorded. So this is only for the plenary sessions. So please let us know if anything, if it contradicts with your ideas. But yes, so welcome everyone once again. I'm Osman Tkansak, a project manager working at Formas, a Swedish research agency for sustainable development. And today we are going to have a seminar with you, a workshop, maybe more concretely, to investigate the needs and opportunities for enrolling a training program that can support the implementation of the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. So maybe we can move to the next slide, Cecile. Yes, these were my welcome words, maybe the next one. So for today, we have more than 50 registered participants, and a majority of them are among the Biodiversity Plus partners. But in addition to our partners in Biodiversity Plus, we have researchers who have been funded previously through other biodiversity calls. We have our invited speakers. They will give us some presentations today to set the scene for our discussions. And then we have other participants who have been contacted via the wider network of our Biodiversity Plus partners, and also the engaged stakeholder board of the enlarged stakeholder board of the Biodiversity Plus. So next slide, please. To quickly go over the objectives of the seminar today, but most of you are already familiar with, but the biodiversity, it is important to understand the overall context of the Biodiversity Plus partnership to understand why we are focusing on the Biodiversity Strategy 2030. And within this partnership, we have some operational objectives. They are manifested through 7 work packages. And among these work packages, we have research and innovation programs that they will be mostly facilitated through transnational calls. We have our contributions for the transnational biodiversity monitoring activities, nature-based solutions, and evaluation of biodiversity is an important aspect of the partnership in general. But for today, more specifically, we would like to enhance the capacity to make the connections between science and policy, and this is also manifested in work package 4. So it is really important that we make sure the evidence-based research results are translated into the policy-making process, and this can be a good opportunity for achieving the targets of the biodiversity strategy by 2030. So next slide, please. And again, in relation to this overall objectives, we have the strategic research and innovation agenda of Biodiversity Plus. So we have 2 cross-cutting teams, and these are better knowledge on biodiversity and its dynamics, and also better knowledge for nature-based solutions in a global change context. Then there we have the topical teams. This can be seen as an enabling transaction between the cross-cutting teams, and they are also underlined through the flagship programs within the Biodiversity Plus partnership, and they are including the biodiversity protection and restoration, transformative change, and the EU's global action. But of course, the more detail can be found in the Syria document, which is available online. And next slide, please. Well, to speaking more specifically about the figures, we in the Biodiversity Plus, we have a budget of total 800 million euros that will be used through 7 years. And it is a combination of both in cash and in-kind resources enabled by the partners. So, and of course, we have the European Commission's support, which is approximately which reaches up to 165 million euros. And in this next 7 years, there are 6 calls planned in total. And on average, we foresee that 42 million will be allocated in cash per call. Yes, but the calls are not the only means of activities for the partnership program, and there will be several other actions like we are trying to do with this subtask. So next slide, please. Well, so this science policy interactions are a subject of the work package 4, as I told, and the main objectives of this work package 4 may be explored further for you to better understand the context. So this work package is mainly focusing on improving the information exchange between science, policy, and stakeholders. And when we are doing it, we want to do it both at upstream level and downstream level. Which means that we have different sorts of activities, including dialogue with the key stakeholders, like foresight exercises and enrolling training programs, among others. So the collaboration, when we are improving this collaboration, we do it in 2 stages. The first one is related to different levels, geographical levels, so to speak, and this can range from local to national and to European level, while we are ensuring our communication and dialogue with the policymakers. Then it also, of course, includes a dialogue with the sectors that are related to biodiversity. And then the second dimension is about the areas. So different areas of biodiversity and the actors are included within these activities. So we pay close attention to work with environmental agencies, research and innovation policymakers, and including the program funders. So who establishes most of the partners in the partnership program. Then finally, like I think it is our key strength that we should underline significantly. We aspire to reinforce the scientific knowledge base on important policy issues, and where we are aiming to do it by producing policy options and also creating guidance documents, the guidance activities for the implementation of key strategic issues, including the EU Biodiversity Strategy, among others. So the next slide, please. Yes, I think I can cover this quickly in order not to steal time from the other speakers. So we conduct our activities in several levels, as I explained. So at the upstream level, we give priority for ensuring dialogue and also desk studies for foresight activities. So we have our means and plans for communicating with different policymakers. Then the midstream level is our main focus today. At midstream level, we would like to mainly set up communities and set up communities of practice and knowledge hubs. And within this subtask, our ultimate goal is to establish this forum, which is going to develop a training program to enroll and to support the EU policies. Then at downstream level, there will be more specific policy products, and we want to create some success stories to share with the relevant partners. So the next slide, please. Maybe, yeah, to be more specific about our objectives today with the seminar. So we want to learn more about the EU Biodiversity Strategy, and to do that, we have like very competent speakers with us today. It's going to be Frank Wesson from the DG Environment, European Commission, who is going to tell us about the European Commission's guidelines on implementation of the biodiversity strategy, and he will also provide us a broader perspective about the strategy. Then through the breakout sessions, we will discuss the needs for trainings to reach these targets. But I really have to emphasize and underline one point, that Biodiversity Plus is not the sole actor to actually increase the capacity of actors. It requires a joint effort by many agencies, and we are only one actor within that. And we are, as I mentioned, our main strength is to ensure science and policy interactions. But we are also aware of the several actors who are very competent on developing the training activities, including the European Biodiversity Platform and the Knowledge Center for Biodiversity. So we are just a complementing actor among this bigger picture. And today we are going to do this exercise through 3 entry points that were identified before. And these 3 entry points, we think that they're all related to the protection aspect, the protection objectives of the EU Biodiversity Strategy. So we start with the ecological criteria. This ecological criteria is important for countries to set up their targets to reach the 30 by 30 objectives, which will be I think explained in more detail after my part. Then after, of course, setting up this ecological criteria by using several tools that are listed here, including important bird areas, key biodiversity areas, and ecologically or biologically significant marine areas. Then I think the next step, we think the next step is to have an effective management mechanism and also the monitoring mechanism. So it's not only about setting the criteria, but doing the right management measures, policies to accomplish them. And finally, from a more qualitative aspect, it is also very crucial that the ecological connectivity is ensured across these protected areas through maybe establishing ecological corridors and so on. And in this aspect, I think we also need to increase the capacity of member states and all relevant actors. So yes, I think I speak a bit fast, but my time was only limited with 10 minutes. So I think I will leave the floor to our first speaker. And it's Frank Wesson from European Commission. And his talk will be about the European guidance document on protected areas. And I hope Frank is ready. And thank you so much.
Yes, I'm ready. I see that you are sharing my presentation, so I will just say next slide, please. So yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Frank Vasten. I'm working in DG Environment in the Nature Unit, including on the biodiversity strategy targets. My main focus is on a target for improving the conservation status of species and habitats and achieving non-deterioration in all species and habitats by 2030. And then in addition, I'm also acting currently as a backup for the target on protected areas. So the first slide is about a bit of a background. So as you probably know, the biodiversity strategy for 2030 was adopted in May 2020. Its content was largely based on the recognition that we are still losing biodiversity despite all the efforts that we have been taking so far. And that in addition, it is not just anymore enough to protect what is there, that we also need to restore nature. So there's this double objective on improving the protection and restoring nature. So the restoration aspect is perhaps the more innovative aspect of the strategy. And that is also reflected in the 2 headline targets. The first one is to establish a larger coherent EU-wide network of protected areas. And the second one, with a whole range of sub-targets, is to develop a new nature restoration plan. So in my presentation, I will only talk about the first one. I should also say that this is not just a Commission strategy. It was endorsed by the member states through a Council conclusion and also by the European Parliament, which means that we now have a political mandate to work on the targets. Next slide, please. So as regards the protected area targets in the strategy, you know that we have a Natura 2000 network, which currently covers 18% of the EU land area and about 9% of the EU marine area. We also have nationally protected areas, and altogether, it seems that if we take all these national protected areas on land, we could come to about 26% of coverage by protected areas. Our objective is to achieve 30%, both for the EU land and freshwater area and for the EU sea area by 2030. And the strategy also says that 1/3 of this, which is then 10% of the EU land and sea area, should be strictly protected by 2030. It's not just enough to have an increased area coverage. These protected areas should also by 2030 be effectively managed, which means that they have clearly identified and defined conservation objectives and measures, an effective management in place, both to avoid deterioration and to make progress if needed, so to restore, and they should also be appropriately monitored. Next slide, please. So the strategy said that the Commission would come up with additional guidance on how to interpret the provisions for protected areas, and this guidance was subject to long discussion, a lot of iterations with the member states, and in particular with a nature directive expert group of the member states. And the final version of a Commission guidance note, which reflects the consensus that we achieved more or less with the member states, was issued on 28 January 2020. And it clarifies a number of points which were already sometimes stated in the strategy itself, but I think there is more detail, more flesh on in the guidance note. Well, it clarifies again that the target for 30% of protected areas shall include legally protected areas, such as Natura 2000 sites. And of course, there will be no change in any legal obligation. The requirements of a Birds and Habitats Directive continue to apply to these. It shall include existing protected areas under national schemes, such as nature reserves and others. But it shall also include some new areas because we are not yet at 30%. So there will be a need to designate some additional protected areas. And that's certainly the biggest challenge for the target. One of the elements is that this coherent network, it shall ensure, of course, coherence, and we can discuss later on what it means. It shall also integrate the idea of ecological corridors. So the network should be coherent and connected, for example, to prevent genetic isolation, to allow species migrations, to maintain and enhance healthy ecosystems. And just to give you an example, we know that a lot of protected areas with the general evolution of land use intensification might have been sufficiently large 30 years ago, but are not anymore. So in order to keep the network sufficiently coherent, there might be a need, not necessarily to focus on corridors, but certainly to increase some of the protected areas that are currently too small, hoping that this would help ensuring coherence, but also perhaps improve connectivity. The note also says that other effective area-based conservation measures, so-called OECMs, and also urban green areas should be considered for the target. And it says that areas that should be restored or that would be restored should also be included in the network to make sure that the restoration investment is sustainable in the long term. Next slide, please. It's perhaps also important to clarify the geographic scope because the target, the 30% target, relates to the entire European Union. So when we talk about 30%, it doesn't necessarily be 30% or 10% for the strict protection target in each and every member state. We know that some countries and member states have, of course, higher population densities and might not be able to achieve such a high coverage, which means that we need some burden sharing and some agreement on the relative contribution of each of the member states. And The strategy says that each member state should provide a fair share to the target. Now, in the Commission guidance note, we have proposed that both the 30% and the 10% target should be not only be achieved for the entire EU, but also for each of the EU biogeographical regions and sea basins. So this is a bit of a delineation, a sub-delineation of a target, but still there is some flexibility within each of the regions, because a region often includes many member states. The target also covers marine and terrestrial ecosystems in EU's outermost regions, which is of particular importance for France, because France holds very high share of the EU outermost regions through its 5 or 6 regions scattered on the globe. So all in all, the guidance note says that all member states are expected to contribute towards reaching the target to an extent that is proportionate to the natural values they host and the potential they have for restoration. And that will be a challenge to identify what that means in practice. I expect some intense discussions on this in the coming years. Just for information, the strategy says also for overseas countries and territories which are not part of a EU territory, there should be a similar process put in place with equivalent mechanisms and rules, but this will not be counted for the target achievement at EU level. So this is more an addition to the EU level targets. Next slide, please. So the key issue that generated most information during the discussion on the guidance note was the definition of strict protection. Well, it's clear that what is strictly protected needs to be legally protected as such. And these strictly protected areas, I think this was already in the strategy itself, should include all old growth and primary forests that remain in the EU, but also other carbon-rich ecosystems such as peatlands, grasslands, some marine and coastal ecosystems that hold important amounts of carbon back, but also any other ecosystem that would require strict protection. And in the strategy, there was a focus on natural processes, so on areas that are essentially left undisturbed from any human intervention, which doesn't mean that human activities are totally excluded, but they should not be disturbing to the ecological processes. Now, in the course of a discussion, member states said, well, this is ignoring a bit the fact that in Europe we have a lot of ecosystems and habitats that require active management, and they said that this should also be part of a strict protection target. So in the final version of the Commission guidance note, it is clearly mentioned that both non-intervention areas and also areas where active management is required, and think about grasslands, very species-rich grasslands that require some type of grazing or mowing, they would also count for the 10% target. Of course, whenever we talk about strict protection, this should be functionally meaningful areas, which means that the size should be sufficient to achieve the necessary, to the desired conservation outcome. Next slide, please. So just this summarizes a bit the difference between protection and strict protection, because this is always a discussion. I think that in a nutshell, you can say that we talk about strict protection whenever there is no compromise with other objectives on the land that is protected. And we talk about protection as soon as there is some level of compromise. So what does it mean in practice? For the 30% target, that would include any areas where there are conservation objectives, and they can be less ambitious than the maximum ecological site potential, whereas for strict protection, they should strive for the maximum ecological site potential, whether non-intervention or some ecosystems that require active management. And when we talk about protection, as I mentioned, it may reflect, the management may reflect a compromise with other objectives, whereas for strict protection, there should be no such compromise. And as an example, extractive activities may take place in protected areas, but they, in strictly protected areas, they would only be allowed if they are needed to achieve the conservation objectives, or if they would be absolutely marginal. And an example might be berry picking, for example. Next slide, please.
Frank,
So,
sorry, may I intervene maybe in a couple of minutes? Can you finalize? Thank you.
yes. So how to achieve the targets? Well, first of all, there is a need to complete any remaining gaps in the Natura 2000 network, which is most relevant for marine species and habitats. And then with regard to other protected areas, we think that the main focus should be on identifying those species and habitats that require additional areas. And this could be also species protected under EU nature legislation, but we would expect them to be also include those that are not covered by EU nature legislation, but are red listed. And so it is then for those species and habitats, if the approach would be science-based, that the most suitable areas should be designated. This could be either new areas or site extensions. Next slide. So the mechanism is that by the end of this year, we expect member states to make their initial pledges for the new areas to be designated, also to clarify the baseline. And we have a format for this where they have to explain the criteria used for the identification of the areas and the scientific evidence used for designation or identification. And then in the next step, there will be a discussion in the frame of so-called biogeographical seminars, which will take place in early 23 to assess whether the pledges are sufficient to achieve the desired outcome by 2030. Next slide. It will also, so the pledges also include an element on effective management of protected areas. And just to remind, what are the key elements of effectively manage protected areas? First of all, there should be an element of non-deterioration. There should be clear and quantified conservation objectives and conservation measures. There should be some level of monitoring to ensure that the protection works, and the site should have an active, effective management. Yes. Next. Yeah, I will skip that. This is basically about the format for the national pledges. This is published information. We are currently working on an electronic format for the pledges, where we ask the information here. And the next steps is that, so the format is being developed. It will be published by in late summer this year. And then member states will need to submit the pledges in the course of this year. We would expect them mostly to be submitted in the end of 22. And then we have the biogeographic seminars to assess the pledges in early 23. Next slide. So that was it. Thank you for your attention. And sorry if it took a bit more time than foreseen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. This very useful introduction. I think you addressed most of the questions that we need to know at the initial stage. Maybe we can have one or two questions if we have any for now. I see there's an interaction going on in the chat, but I think it is resolved there. But if you have any questions, you can raise your hand.
Lars is raising his hand, Osman.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't see. Yeah, please, maybe, we can take the question, please.
Yeah, many thanks for a very interesting presentation, Frank. I just have a question towards kind of legal aspects. As far as I recall, in the strategy, there's also mentioned something about that the strategy could imply that its legal aspects is taking part, so that it's I mean, legal upon the member states to actually implement this. Can you say a little bit of what is the status of these considerations within the Commission, and how do you think about this kind of enforcement, or whatever we should call it? Thank you.
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure what exactly you're referring to, but in the strategy, it is mentioned that if there would be no progress, the Commission might consider some legal proposal for protected area targets in 2024. So in the frame of a midterm review. I mean, this is still too early to discuss this, whether this is happening or not. Is that the point you wanted to raise, or is it more about the legal status that the site should have?
No, that is the point I wanted to raise.
Okay. So I'm afraid I can't say much more about this. There is no real discussion or thinking on this aspect for the moment being.
Thank you. Then I see Helen Sobel for a second question, please, Helen.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have just a question about the direct and indirect drivers of change mentioned by IBES. I don't really get the point in your presentation. Should those drivers be considered in a strategy? I think yes, even in protected areas, and especially in the 20% not fully protected, because we know very well now that depending on the status of the protected area, it could be efficient or not. And we have some research project and research results that show that if a protected area is not fully protected, sometimes, very often, I should say, they are not efficient. And so I think we should consider also reducing all the direct drivers of change, such as pollution, land use change, and exploitation of biodiversity resources, and so on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I see your point, but maybe just to clarify that indeed it's not specifically, there is no mechanism foreseen in the strategy for this, as far as the protected area target is concerned. We are more looking from an outcome objective perspective, and then it is more, let's say, the freedom of the member states to decide how they achieve these objectives. And of course, this is very often linked, or this very often requires to tackle specific drivers. But the approach is perhaps more outcome driven in the strategy, and specifically for the protected areas other than the strict protected areas. The issue that you mentioned is absolutely crucial, but it means that in practice, we would expect that many protected areas need much better defined conservation objectives, and of course a mechanism to implement those. But this is not going via the process; it's going via the outcome in the strategy. So perhaps that is the difference from what is mentioned by IPBES. And in fact, our experience is that it is easier to achieve a protected area status with a clear outcome, and then it is left to the flexibility of the member states to see how they come to this outcome, as long as the outcome is the right one, is the relevant one, which might also generate some discussions. Now, as you might know, there is also the discussion on the nature restoration law, where the approach is different. It is an approach that is perhaps more linked to the drivers, but the proposal has not yet been published, and we certainly anticipate very intense discussions on this in the next years. So it's a bit two complementary approaches. And I think this is a good strategy not to put all eggs in the same basket. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Frank. So I think we can continue with our next presentation. These were really detailed and to the point answers, but I think we can also continue the communication through chat. There are a few more questions there. Frank, if you have the time, we would really appreciate if you can address them. And then now I would like to give the floor to Thomas Brooks, who is a chief scientist at IUCN, and his main focus will be about the ecological criteria and ecological connectivity that are related to the biodiversity strategy for 2030. Oh yes, before I leave the floor to Thomas, I would like to share with you the results of the survey that we just shared a couple of weeks ago with you. So these are very basic findings, like what the question was about. We wanted to measure the familiarity of our participants with this ecological criteria that we would like to focus on. So it appears that the graph on the left shows that like 5 is representing the most familiarity, whereas 1 is representing the lesser familiarity. And we have an even distribution, but I think it tends to be more on less familiarity with this ecological criteria. So we would like to learn more about it, of course. Then on the right hand side, you see the again, if we need any trainings on several of the criteria that were listed that are related to, again, ecological criteria. So it appears that the respondents are more interested to have a training maybe on key biodiversity areas, and it is followed by the EBSAS and important bird areas, but we will elaborate on them further during the breakout session. And another question about the ecological connectivity, again, the familiarity level is, I think it's, again, evenly distributed. 26% is given for familiarity, and like a medium level familiarity, and not familiar at all, we can interpret as it is. But again, I think our participants are interested to have maybe a training course related to IUCN guidelines for conserving connectivity. So we will take this into consideration in our future work. But now I would like to leave the floor to Thomas, please.
Thanks, thanks so much, Osman. Can you hear me okay? Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Many thanks indeed to Biodiversa Plus for the opportunity to say a few words to you today about the potential of the key biodiversity areas approach to serve as a tool for supporting implementation of the ecological criteria components of the EU Biodiversity Strategy. Maybe two credits and caveats in starting up here. First of all, to say and to acknowledge the fact that I'm speaking today on behalf of and in collaboration with Andrew Plumtree, who is the head of the Global Key Biodiversity Areas Secretariat. And I serve as one of the IUCN representatives to the Key Biodiversity Areas partnership. Second, just regarding the scope of my comments here, I will say a few words at the end of my talk about ecological connectivity, but that won't be a major focus of my remarks. Perhaps that might be a possible subject for a dedicated follow-up seminar along these lines. Great. So next slide, please. So as Frank Vassen highlighted in his excellent, really clear opening scene-setting remarks, it's going to be really important in thinking about delivering strategies for expansion of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures to focus that expansion onto places that are important for biodiversity. But that clearly leaves open a very large question as to what what such places might be, or what the criteria for identifying such places might be. And there have been lots that have been proposed over the last 4 or 5 decades of conservation science. Some of these are at very broad scales, so things like biodiversity hotspots and global 200 ecoregions, which are intended to steer resources towards broad regions of conservation priority. But more relevant for the specific question of protected area and other effective area-based conservation measure expansion relates to the identification of areas for importance for biodiversity at the site scale, at the level of management on the ground or in the water. Now, since the early 1980s, and in particular across Europe, there have been many different approaches proposed to identifying such important sites, in particular looking across different taxonomic groups, but also across other elements of biodiversity. And so, for example, important bird areas, important butterfly areas, important plant areas, and so on, important freshwater areas. Now, that diversity of approaches has generated quite a lot of important conservation success. It's led to demonstrable positive biodiversity outcomes on the ground, but it has also generated substantial policy confusion with the proliferation of different approaches, leaving national and regional policymakers scratching their heads to think, should we look at the butterfly areas here or the plant areas there or freshwater? How do these things relate and interact? Next slide, please. So with that background, in actually about 20 years ago now, IUCN's government and civil society members came to IUCN in 2004 and requested the development of a global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas, of important sites for biodiversity, based on standardized definitions and criteria and quantitative thresholds to ensure that the identification of important sites could be objective and repeatable and transparent. Crucially, it was mandated that that process not duplicate or set aside or ignore the large body of work that had come before it on identification of important bird areas and important sites for other elements of biodiversity, but rather that it should provide an umbrella approach that brought together and harmonized existing approaches and filled in the gaps. Next slide, please. So that global standard was completed and published in 2016, approved through IUCN's Council and through a resolution in the 2016 IUCN Congress, and established a definition, a formal definition of key biodiversity areas as sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. Next slide, please. Underneath that definition and flowing towards it, allowing its application, are a suite of criteria grouped into 5 classes that allow the application of the identification of important sites for biodiversity across the whole range of different elements, of different levels of ecological organization. So they're designed to reflect sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity at genetic, at species, and at ecosystem levels. So spanning the Convention on Biological Diversity's definition of biodiversity, and designed to represent a range of different components of biodiversity. So for example, threatened biodiversity, we had mentioned from Frank Vasson about threatened species, threatened ecosystems, geographically restricted biodiversity, species or ecosystems which only occur in a handful of places. Ecological integrity, I saw there was some mention in the chat earlier about ecological integrity. Biological process, this provides a hook that leads on to the discussion of ecological connectivity, as Osman highlighted. And then finally, a fifth criterion to represent situations where comprehensive wall-to-wall biodiversity data are available to allow for formal calculation of irreplaceability through wholly quantitative methods. In effect, that E criterion provides a wholly quantitative calibration for the other four criteria. Next slide, please. A crucial property of the key biodiversity areas approach is that it is applied at the national level, or sometimes in big countries at the sub-national level. So key biodiversity area identification processes are all ones which sit within individual nation states. They're supported by the establishment of what are generically called key biodiversity area national coordination groups, although different countries use different terms for the name for that kind of support body. Key biodiversity areas, because the approach, as I mentioned, draws together existing approaches, in particular important bird areas, which have been identified comprehensively around the world, are documented very widely worldwide. There are more than 16,000 key biodiversity areas documented already, about 4,000 of those across Europe. Very many of them are important bird areas, but increasing numbers also important sites documented as important sites for other elements of biodiversity. But as you see on the right there, there are still quite a lot of gaps in the process towards establishment of national coordination groups across Europe, which is a point to which we'll return. Next slide, please. While the data are compiled and site identification is implemented nationally, those data are then shared globally, and so compiled through into the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas, which is maintained by BirdLife International on behalf of the Key Biodiversity Areas Partnership. And as I say, documenting more than 16,000 key biodiversity areas around the world already. Next slide, please. Importantly and highly relevant to the activities of Biodiversa Plus, a key strand of the Key Biodiversity Areas program has been the development of training support. And indeed, this is highly timely. Just a couple of months ago, the Key Biodiversity Areas program released a comprehensive KBA, Key Biodiversity Areas training course. This is all freely available online. It's actually hosted through the Nature Conservancy's conservation training website, and comprises 8 modules of formal training plus a set of associated resources. So Key Biodiversity Areas training material are available and ready to be rolled out to be applied as useful and appropriate. Next slide, please. Key biodiversity areas have been influential and important in helping to focus underlying research. As an example here, key biodiversity areas provided important input data into the IPBES assessments, both into the IPBES regional assessment for Europe and Central Asia. And so in the summary for policymakers of the ECA assessment, there was documentation of actually the intersection between key biodiversity areas and protected areas. So documentation of protection of key biodiversity areas across Europe and Central Asia. And then similarly, an equivalent approach was picked up through the global assessment and represented in the summary for policymakers of the IPBES global assessment. Next slide, please. And I should also emphasize a number of maybe primary research frontiers. For example, in examining the intersections between key biodiversity areas, ecosystem services, and nature-based solutions. As I emphasized, the criteria for identification of key biodiversity areas are ecological ones. aligned with that definition of sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. But clearly, key biodiversity areas yield very many benefits for people. And so assessment of the kind of benefits and the magnitude of those benefits flowing from key biodiversity areas is an important research front. And there's some stats, some facts and figures as to ongoing research on ecosystem services derived from key biodiversity areas. Next slide, please. Key biodiversity areas are also, of course, crucial for focusing biodiversity monitoring. And this again reflects or builds from some of the points highlighted by Frank Vassen. That monitoring can and indeed should increasingly take the form of documentation and tracking of the state of biodiversity at the sites in question, and indeed the impact of their safeguard on that state. So, for example, to track the proportion of elements of biodiversity for which a given site is important, which are at or above a stated reference level of condition, or to track the mean distance of all elements of biodiversity for which the site is important from a stated reference level. Next slide, please. But not just state indicators, but also response indicators are extremely important as relates to monitoring and key biodiversity areas. And this is reflected in numerous processes. So, for example, the Sustainable Development Goal indicators 14.5.1, 15.1.2, and 15.4.1 on important marine sites, important freshwater and terrestrial sites, and important mountain sites, all reflect the extent of coverage, the mean percentage coverage of key biodiversity areas by protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So very much speaking directly to the EU Biodiversity Strategy there. And you can see some headline figures and infographics there from last year's Sustainable Development Goals report on global progress with safeguarding key biodiversity areas. Next slide, please. Final few comments from my side about the importance of key biodiversity areas in providing science-based policy support, and this is relevant across scales, across spatial scales. There's already been some discussion in this seminar about the interplay between national and regional scales, and also highly relevant thinking about science-based policy support across different sectors. And I'll say a few words about each of those points on variation across scales and diversity across sectors. Regarding a direct support to national policy, a key tool here, of course, is land use planning. And so in the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille just last year, IUCN members voted to approve a resolution mandating, calling on governments to inform land use planning based on the documentation of key biodiversity areas, incorporate them into national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Next slide, please. Key biodiversity areas are clearly, something funny happened there with a red list logo, no matter. Key biodiversity areas clearly interact in important ways with underlying data, most notably data from red list processes. And this is worth emphasizing, maybe especially in the context of the EU, where there has been such progress in standardized assessment of species extinction risk across a very large number of taxonomic groups. Now, this is particularly relevant in that many of those red list assessments, of those EU red list assessments, have been taken place subsequent to the establishment of the Birds and Habitats directives and their annexes. And so clearly there are many European threatened species which are not documented in Annex 2 and therefore not directly safeguarded through the Birds and Habitats Directive. So what key biodiversity areas can do is to provide a complementary mechanism for documentation of important sites for threatened species which otherwise risk slipping through the net, to be safeguarded through complementary tools, as was highlighted earlier. The menu of tools is quite diverse and includes other effective area-based conservation measures, as well as protected areas per se, as ways to safeguard those gap species and the important places where they live. Next slide, please.
Yes, Thomas, may I ask you to summarize in 1 minute, please? Thank you.
Sure, one or two slides more. Maybe I could ask for a little bit more than 1 minute, given that I started a little bit late. And so directly speaking to Frank Vassen's charge to us in his opening comments, key biodiversity areas stand to inform the implementation of the EU biodiversity strategy very directly. About 70% of the existing 4,500 European KBAs are Natura 2000 sites, but clearly that leaves about 30% of key biodiversity areas identified already as falling through the Natura 2000 net, and therefore as potential priorities for expansion of safeguard through the EU biodiversity strategy. Next slide, please. And this same kind of approach, using harnessing key biodiversity areas data to guide protected areas expansion towards 2030 targets, is underway around the world, and also clearly crucially relevant, not just in the national and regional context, but also up to the global context of guiding the implementation of the potential target 3 of the draft post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. Key biodiversity areas information is also really important in helping to guide investment. So for example, KFW are harnessing KBA data to guide the location of legacy landscapes. Other entities are drawing from the key biodiversity areas database in channeling resources towards important places for biodiversity. And I should highlight there along the bottom the Key Biodiversity Areas Partnership, which supports implementation of the Key Biodiversity Areas program at the global level. Next slide, please. A final, thinking across sectors, a final point that's worth highlighting is the importance of key biodiversity areas data to the private sector. In this webinar, we're focusing heavily on the conservation audience, on the conservation sector, and supporting implementation of site safeguard. But clearly making key biodiversity areas data available to the commercial and financial sectors is also extremely important to steer potentially harmful economic activities away from the most important places, as well as in allowing for those private sector entities to manage both dependency and reputational risk. And key biodiversity areas data are available for private sector use through what's called the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. Next slide, please. Last couple of slides here. So there was mention at the beginning from Osman about the importance of ecological connectivity and the production just a couple of years ago of the IUCN guidelines on ecological networks and corridors. all I'll do here is just to make the connection between the ecological criteria side of the picture in pointing out the importance of key biodiversity areas as nodes, as focal points for connectivity, for allowing connectivity between them as and where it is appropriate. And as I say, I'd urge that a subsequent session of a subsequent Biodiversity Plus seminar could be convened to dig into ecological connectivity in detail. Final slide, please. And this one just wraps us up with highlighting maybe some suggestions from our side as to potential opportunities for Biodiversa Plus in drawing from the Key Biodiversity Areas program and interacting with it. We've emphasized the importance of training there. I think the training is a really low-hanging fruit, an important near future opportunity across countries and languages. I mentioned the establishment of national coordination groups. This really is another fundamental starting point for stimulating the process of key biodiversity area identification comprehensively, not just across birds and a handful of well-known taxonomic groups for which important sites have been known for many decades, but also to bring in all of those new data from the European Red Lists and data from across ecosystems following the KBA standard. Finally, there are clear opportunities here across maybe the 3 core strands of the Biodiversity Plus strategy of strengthening, prioritizing biodiversity research towards key biodiversity areas, of channeling monitoring towards both the protection and monitoring both the condition and the response of in safeguard of key biodiversity areas. And finally, in providing policy support, above all, towards safeguarding key biodiversity areas beyond the Natura 2000 network within the context of the 2030 strategy. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. It was really interesting to hear from your perspective and how feasible that can be, the KBAs for the overall implementation of the biodiversity strategy. Yes, we can definitely take a few quick questions. Let me see if anyone is raising hand. No, I do not. Then I see again some interactions in the chat, so maybe we can continue our discussions on the chat, and we can save some time already by leaving the floor to our next speaker. So yes, there is no interaction in the chat, and I would like to invite Christian Papp for his presentation on management effectiveness. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Super. So my name is Christian Papp. I'm working for WWF, where I'm responsible for the Wildlife and Landscape National Program in Romania. And my presentation, it will be about management effectiveness of protected areas. At, let's say, global level, but also at regional level, because I will give you a specific example. One tool that we are using here in the Carpathians, and by the way, the picture in the background is from the Carpathians. And very briefly, this is the content of my presentation. And yeah, you might ask yourself, why do we need management effectiveness? I mean, first of all, CBD created a frame for performing protected area management effectiveness assessments. And according to its 8th theme, protected areas only work as conservation tools if they are managed effectively to maintain their values in perpetuity. And I hope that you agree with this statement. However, in order to perform protected area management effectiveness, we need to consider 3 key steps. First of all, to identify and agree different sets of standards. We all know the importance of standardization. Then to develop a system of assessment and to establish a system to monitor, of course, the changes and the trend, because it's important to track the progress in protected area management effectiveness. In terms of the global assessments, here I would refer first of all to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is one of the key policies. Of course, there are some other key policy instruments emphasizing the need for protected area management effectiveness evaluation. But I think that in this context, it's really important to stress again the need to have effectively managed protected area systems. And this is clearly stated in this Global Biodiversity Framework. However, there are different issues related to these assessments. There are many methodologies out there. Unfortunately, not all of them are actually connected, or well, there are limited, let's say, connection between these sites or tools that are performed for various protected areas or sites. And unfortunately, because of this, there is no consistent or comparable data that can be used for more in-depth assessments, especially at the global level. And this is the site of the global database that includes all relevant tools that are available. And of course, you can find here different details about every single tool, including year of assessment and so on. And you might know that the number of protected areas is still increasing. I mean, currently we have close to 270,000 protected areas, which represents over 15% of the total terrestrial surface in terms of protection, and over 8% of the marine surface is also protected through these protected areas. Unfortunately, there are only 20,000 assessments done for individual protected areas, which means more than 7% of the total protected areas number, which is not too much. And here you can see the status of the assessments that have been performed since 1966. Of course, at the beginning, there were more assessments performed if we are considering the percentage of sites assessed compared to the total number of protected areas. However, we have to mention that the number of protected areas, as I also pointed out before, is exponentially increasing, or at least used to increase to some extent by 2010. In Romania, for instance, we are not doing that good in terms of the assessments. We have less than 5% of the total number of protected areas assessed. We were using once RAPAM in 2006, and then another tool which I will introduce a bit later in more detail, the Carpathian Protected Area Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool. And in Romania, this was used between 2009 and 2013. Regarding the main assessment approaches, there are 76 tools included in the global database. And there are, of course, two main categories of protected area management effectiveness tools. First of all, we can talk about tools that can assess the effectiveness of protected area systems, like the rapid assessment and prioritization methodology. And there are many tools which are focusing on individual protected areas or sites, including METS, the Carpathian Protected Areas MET, or IUCN Green List, the Europark Quality Criteria and Standards for National Parks. And of course, there are various other tools, including ones related to palm parks, for instance. The MET is the widest used tool. And here you can see where it was performed, of course, in on continents like Asia, Africa, or South America. We have most of the assessments performed with this tool. We also have to mention here that MET is in a way connected with the project funded by the World Bank. So for these types of projects, it's a prerequisite to use the MET before and also after the different conservation projects to track the progress and let's say efficiency in terms of conservation. Coming to the European perspective, of course, the Biodiversity Strategy 2030 is a key instrument that is actually, again, encouraging the assessment of the progress in protected areas. And this is actually one of the key commitments of this strategy to ensure effective management of all protected areas. And this can be done by implementing such instruments. And in the following, I will briefly introduce you the Carpathian Protected Area Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool. But first, I would like to give you some background data about the Carpathians. As you might know, the Carpathians are one of the last biodiversity hotspots in Europe, and they host more than 60,000 native species, including 4,000 vascular plants and 500 vertebrate species, including 7,200 brown bears, 4,000 wolves, and 2,400 lynxes. We have a Carpathian network of protected areas, and here you can see where they are on the map. And this network is also complemented by several Natura 2000 and Emerald sites. So I think that in terms of, let's say, protection, we are doing fine. However, there are more and more threats to these biodiversity values, including the development of linear transport infrastructure. The CPA MET is an online tool, and it was actually developed based on the original management effectiveness tracking tool. And it has the two key components. The first one is collecting general information about the individual protected area. And the second component is actually performing the assessment of the management effectiveness. And this tool is included in the global database. It was also documented since 2010 in various key documents regarding protected area management effectiveness. And what can generate this tool? First of all, if you are talking about the first component, you can get different types of relevant information. For instance, you can have access to the individual protected areas or sites. You can access, for instance, the size of the protected areas. You can do networking. You can find different experts that are actually included by every single protected area here. And furthermore, you can also have different percentages, including in terms of the threats to the biodiversity from these protected areas from the Carpathians, which is again a really nice tool. I would say you can, of course, use different filters. You can select a certain protected area category. You can do this interrogation at the whole Carpathian level or only at one country level from the Carpathian region and so on. Another example is related to the land use, and here, for instance, you can see that over 50% of the land use is dedicated to forests in the Carpathians. Then the second component is dedicated to the assessment per se, and here we have 42 questions or indicators, and for each question we have different types of answers. The original map contained less questions, but we wanted to extend them and to kind of adapt the tool to the Carpathian context. This is why we ended up with 42 questions. And there are different types of results that can be generated by using this tool. And you can do it, for instance, for having, well, the CPA map performed over more years in a row. You can compare the status or the effectiveness of the management in time, which is, I think, great, especially if you have a change in terms of the management of the protected area. You can also separately generate the MET report by only, well, selecting this part, which is actually considering the original 30 questions from the MET. And what I was not mentioning is that we translated this tool in all the Carpathian languages, plus we also adapted it for Bulgaria. And there were different requests from Asia as well to develop a similar tool for the tiger protected area, for tiger-related protected areas. The tool can also generate different graphs so that you can use it for well, different presentations, for instance, to show to the donors. What we recommend is to, of course, perform this assessment, and not just this assessment, but any kind of assessment together with other key stakeholders, including various environmental agencies, local communities, NGOs, and so on, just to make sure that there is more objectivity when performing such an assessment. The tool is based on the WCPA framework, which is, of course, also the base for the original MET. And we developed guidelines, which was translated in every single Carpathian language, so that it can be used easier by everybody. There are different strengths, of course, associated with this instrument. Here are some of them. And the fact that you can have the whole data in one database, I think that's already a huge advantage. Plus, you can perform different interrogations so that you can get the best out of the database. There are also some limitations, of course, if only one person is performing the assessment, like we experienced, well, in some places, having only the protected area manager doing it, that's, of course, not very accurate, and we don't encourage this. So in order to increase the objectivity, yeah, it's good to do it together with other stakeholders. Of course, the protected areas need to have a reliable internet connection, but this is not, I think, the case anymore, hopefully. And another, let's say, issue is that we did not manage to improve the CPA MET to consider the changes that were performed to MET. And we are talking about the MET 4 here, which is, let's say, the latest fashion in terms of protected area management effectiveness. And I would like to briefly...
last 2 minutes, can you summarize, please?
Yeah, sure, I will do it in 1 minute, actually. Yeah, so I think that it's worth mentioning that the latest version of the MET was released last year, and is, let's say, quite user-friendly. I also tried it, and it's well, it's definitely improved compared to the first version from 2001. It also has the advantage to generate different statistics, graphs, and so on, which is always good. And what I also like about MET4 is that connectivity is a key issue that is addressed. And this was kind of missing from the previous MET, and well, this is also missing from the CPA MET, obviously. This is why we would like to upgrade the Carpathian Protected Area Management Effectiveness tracking tool. Yeah, so I think that the key message in the end is that there are various tools out there. It's important to select the best one. If it's really needed, one of the tools can be actually adapted to the specific needs, as we did it for the Carpathians. And yeah, I think that we have to make some more efforts in order to increase the number of protected areas that are assessed in the future. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian, for your interesting presentation. And I'm keeping an eye on the chat as well, so it is really nice to see that there are some good interactions going on there. So Helen's question to Thomas was about how to define the area of ecological significance, and I see that Thomas has responded with some interesting links where more information can be found. So thank you so much for this interactive process. And do we have any questions? I see Thomas is raising hand, so please, Thomas.
Thanks very much, Christian. Thanks for the really excellent presentation there. Really fantastic to see the breadth of tools for monitoring and tracking protected area management effectiveness and the convergence of these towards the most effective ones. I wanted to ask your view on where you see we've got, as you've described, we've got really good as a community over recent decades in tracking protected area inputs and activities, tracking protected area management. Whereas I think that we remain less strong in tracking protected area impacts. What's your view on how and how soon we may be able to bring tools for actually understanding the impacts of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures onto the biodiversity for which they're important? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really good question, actually. I mean, first of all, I think that it would be really crucial, to repeat all these assessments, because it's not enough to do it just once. You have to do it at least, I don't know, every second or third year. Then you can measure actually the progress. On the other hand, I think that we need some more standardization, because if one protected area is doing in its own way and another one from the same country in a totally different way, then you cannot really compare the results. And I would also recommend the mix of performing in the assessments of individual protected areas together with system level assessments. That's another key issue I think that is kind of missing. Of course, we can see in all these relevant policy documents that management effectiveness is encouraged. However, I think that we have to see this into practice as well. And we fail as conservation community to trigger these changes we are talking about for over a decade, or well, even more. And yeah, we have to to consolidate our community, I think, and to work with other key stakeholders, because we cannot do it only by ourselves. And I think that also the general public has to understand that protected areas are great. However, they need some more support. And if we manage to perform such assessments in the right way, we can, bring in maybe some more arguments, for protection and for leveraging some more funds towards protection and conservation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian. And then we have no more questions, I suppose. So we are lagging a little bit behind our schedule, but I think we can cover this time. And now I will leave the floor to my colleague Cecilia for introducing us the breakout group sessions and the technicalities. So please, Cecile.
Yeah, many thanks, Osman. And so we are reaching the end of the very first session of our meeting. So now we will go into subgroups. So we will have 4 subgroups, and you will automatically be led into one subgroup. So the message that appears on my slide should pop in on your screen, and you will just have to click on the blue button join. So if it doesn't work, just send me a message in the chat and I will try to help you. And yeah, at the end of the discussions, you will have the possibility to leave the room and you will have to click on the leave room button at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, that's it from my side. We will now stop the recording. Let's see.
So thank you so much, and well, welcome once again, everyone. I see we lost some of our the large group, so we are 26 now. But I'm sure that there had been enough people at the breakout group, so there were some fruitful discussions. At least this was the case in our group. Then I think now it is time to wrap up the discussions to summarize what we did in our breakout groups. And we will start with group 1, which was the group that I facilitated. And actually I will be the rapporteur for our group because I made this mistake for not asking for volunteers at the beginning of the session, but I think we can manage it well. And I will ask the colleagues if I miss anything important to complete my words. So with the group 1, when identifying the challenges, we had really several of them. The issue was about how to actually categorize them into different groups, and we had a nice suggestion to categorize them into 3 groups under 3 lines. So on top you have the more like EU level, regional level challenges that might hinder us from implementing the EU Biodiversity Strategy. And this top level challenges can include the necessity for negotiation between the member states for identifying the protected areas. And there might be some lack of coordination when it comes to governance of the decision makers, again, at the top level. Then, of course, there's a huge need for ensuring the trade-offs are made in a peaceful manner between the key partners. So because at the end of the day, it also is a process where some key stakeholders may lose their privileges or their advantages in the process. Then at the second level, we have the stakeholders in general, not only at the top level, EU level, but these are the challenges related with the stakeholders and the communication between stakeholders and the working culture between the stakeholders. How do they come together? And like at the trainings, when we identified the trainings and the needs with the question tree, we had many suggestions that point out to this issue, that we need better communication channels between the stakeholders. And like to be more specific, there was this suggestion that a training program can be actually supplemented with this innovative games that we see more and more, like the board games that help decision makers to increase the decision-making capacity as a decision support tool. So we can actually go for that. Yes, it will also be useful if we can provide specific trainings for specific groups, including the farmers, fisheries, who may be affected most by the process. Then at the bottom level, so we have the protected areas concept in general. So, well, what might be the challenges within the protected areas? How to like set up the criteria, how to manage them effectively, and how we can monitor the management processes at the protected areas. One thing is that one challenge is that it is a high costly process to develop this effective monitoring schemes. And then another important part was So there is a huge fragmentation across the protected areas, especially through the highways or the railroads. So we need to maybe more innovative with our thinking when it comes to making integration of these areas. And for that, more concrete suggestion, one of the more concrete suggestion was to maybe focus more on the GIS and the distance monitoring technologies when making planning in these areas. So, well, there were a lot of information that we need more time to digest, but it is my very quick summary about the discussions. But if any of the colleagues would like to add up on that, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I think we can move to the second one. Okay. Yes. I think it is Hilde who is facilitating the second group, so I'll leave the floor for her. Thank you.
I was facilitating, but we have Eva who will do the debrief from this group.
Okay, so we had quite also intensive discussions, and we tried to put all those ideas into some groups. But I will start with the challenges. So in relation to the challenges, it was a lot of discussions about the management, like how we also understand the management and how the management is done, if it is done properly or not, or this is only on paper, or it is really the sites are managed in a way how they should be, because there might be also differences between that we will achieve the targets, but maybe the figures will not really show the reality, that the protected areas will be maybe designated in the wrong places. Then also, for example, what does it mean, the conservation targets, if they are really clear for the areas and if they are really understood properly. Then the coordination between the management processes should be also improved, because we might have maybe similar approaches, but there are of course differences between the member states. So also the coordination between those processes should be also somehow improved. And in relation, for example, to the marine areas where there are no clear boundaries, there will be also quite important how the coordination of the management of these maritime areas will be coordinated. And as I mentioned, there are 27 member states, so maybe the coordination also among those member states on different processes, not only in management, but also in other areas, should be coordinated. Then very important is the discussion with the general public, that maybe sometimes in our field and more, maybe also in the political level, some of the goals are quite clear, but the general public doesn't really understand all the details. So this should be also clarified quite a lot, or much better. And very important is also discussions with the stakeholders and with the owners. And abroad all of this, it's very important how the political will and challenges are there. If there is enough of capacities, which is also sometimes the case that there are not enough capacities, but if there is not a proper political will or support, it's very difficult to fulfill all the requirements. So this is also one of the main challenges. And some of the problems raised also from the pandemic period, where we realized that there is a quite pressure on the protected areas, especially national parks, that they are really visited maybe too much, and there should be also some kind of limitation with the numbers in the parks or in the protected areas. So this was the part related to the challenges. Then in relation to the trainings, we just realized that there are several training materials, for example, for OECM or green list of protected and conserved areas, or for example, the red lists, which are there, but maybe biodiversity could be one of the tools which would streamline all these materials together, and it will be maybe easier to spread them around. A very good idea was maybe to use also the red lists, which include a lot of data about the species, but we are not really going into the details and we are not really using them with all the data which are behind those red lists. So this can be used much more in details. And then in relation also to the monitoring or the needs for the trainings, it would be maybe really good if a member state should appoint some people who will be dealing with the trainings and they will be trained. So they maybe also later on can prepare some kind of national packages or strategies for following up with all those trainings. And the Biodiversa can funding this kind of training programs for distribution of all this information. Maybe it will be also important to mainstream all the indicators from the monitoring tools into the national statistical organizations, because we are using those data for also different purposes, like for example, for the implementation of SDGs. And also the discussion was dealt with the trainings that they are sometimes or often very theoretical, and we should make them more operational and more practical on the ground. So this can be also part where Biodiversa can help. And I think that's all. If I forgot something, you can just add.
No, perfect. The only thing that I forgot was to ask for thumbs. So there's still a lot of thumbs at the bottom of the page, but I think the whole conversation converged to the fact that there's indeed a lot of material out there, and we see and we do think there's willingness at the country level to get it rolled out, and we could use Biodiversa as a structure to do so, including also through some of the national hubs that we have. But I forgot the thumbs question, so sorry for that.
I also forgot one thing about the strict protection and definitions related to it, which should be also clarified, because there are now different views on what the strict or strong protection of protected areas means.
Okay, thank you so much for this nice summary. Then now it is the group 3 next. It's Robin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Please, Robin.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. So we report on this group 3. So for the first question, sorry for our figure is quite messy regarding the other one. So on the first question, maybe the proposition can be grouped in some packages. So we identify one package about capacity building and resource mobilization on all the aspect about economic mainstreaming and can help for the EU strategy implementation. This is quite interfaced with other packages in this group 1, in this question 1, excuse me, on the question of the values of biodiversity and the political vision that policymakers may have for this implementation. And so this is interfaced with this political and sectorial mainstreaming and the integration of factors. It's one of the challenge. On other package, we have the question of the integration of the scientific results and the links to CBD targets. And maybe on the last package, some technical and scientific issues that we have to cooperate and coordinate between EU member states on what management effectiveness is and its definition, and the question of the connectivity between ecological connectivity between countries. So for the question 2, there were several propositions that established that already existing things are in place to make this up. So and also we discussed about the need to identify national structures that act as science policy interface, so that can help to implement the EU strategies. And for the third one, question 3, So we discuss about principles and generic activities like to build on what's already exists and not to reinvent the wheel. And following this identification of the existing initiatives, think about new research programs on biodiversity for the implementation of biodiversity strategies. As activities, we also have we discussed about the large communication on research results on the public, and the need also to show success stories and inspiring cases, and in a more general way to insist on what works, and to have a positive view on what can be done instead of looking what doesn't work, and maybe think of trainings, but maybe the term is too weak for what we intend. Trainings for scientists and project participants on how to integrate results into biodiversity strategy implementation. And we wonder if biodiversity could help on the coordination of European national science policy interfaces that can exist. And we also wonder at last if these activities already encompassed or not in IPBS activities. So maybe some people in the groups may respond to this on the IPBS aspect. So I hope I didn't miss anything. So maybe if people from the group 3 could complement if I did. So that's it.
Thank you, Robin. I think it was super complete, and yeah, maybe regarding just that last point, we had a discussion about indeed national structures acting as science policy interface, and possibly a role for linking these up through Biodiversity Plus. And I think, if I recall well, Hilde or Agnès, especially, I think you would know, in the Pan-European Stakeholder Conference, the best context. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Agnès. I see in the chat the ECA platform. Okay. So this is something we can add to our blue column, I believe. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you, Frederick, for the complementing points. Then we will move with the fourth group. So the facilitator was Mariam, and the reporter, please step in.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'll let him have the floor then.
And thanks, Mariam. Yeah, I decided to be a reporter because I'm a toddler to Biodiversity Plus, galaxy away from this topic, and it's good to be out of the box from time to time. So now I have a chance to do so. And of course, I ask my team to help me if I miss some important points. As for challenges, we'll cover, in spite actually of coming from pretty different countries and backgrounds, we were surprisingly coherent on our views regarding challenges, which may make troubles to reach the BS targets. And we're covering various points and of different kind and impacts, such as do we have enough time to reach the targets by 2030? We are in the middle of 2022, and time does fly. So that was the first point. Do we have enough political will around to do so? Do we have enough coherence and focus on the goals to do so? Are we, as the members of the EU, the 27 members, they are compatible enough to do it? I mean, the old EU countries, the new EU countries, and we are discussing that point. In the background, actually, I made a research regarding the new protected areas in Poland. In other words, when our youngest, last national park in Poland was established, and that was 21 years ago. 2001. And since then, there were no new parks in this country, and actually the already existing parks struggled to survive the case of Białowieża wild forest, perhaps known to you as a good example. So there is a pretty lack of compatibility between countries, I would say, or we would say. What else? What about the bad game changers to Biodiversa plus plans and dreams, like post-COVID situation, like war in Ukraine, like troubles with Russia, etc., etc. So these were the thoughts regarding challenges. As for existing training programs, we were surprisingly quiet and not talkative on this point. However, when it came to the question number 3, needs for future trainings, support from Biodiversa plan, the situation looks slightly better in that respect. And we pointed on the necessity to more engage stakeholders, a very, very common, apparently, point of view among the groups. However, we also pointed the necessity to increase citizen awareness. How to do it, that's another point. We were also focusing perhaps the necessity to somehow complement the 27 national discussions, which are linked with widely understood biodiversity, somehow to the pan-European level. And then the last point, which was largely unspoken till Tanya actually expressed that, was whether, of course, what I will tell you now is beyond Biodiversa plus capacity, but whether the necessity to reach the Biodiversity Strategy 2030 targets should not be somehow enforced, like it is in case of the climate policy. They are now recommendations, but perhaps, yeah, there should be something more like that. So Tanya said so, and actually as a group, we agreed to that suggestion. So probably, unless I miss some critical points, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think it was really complete recap of the discussion that we had in our group.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you all for these very nice summaries. Seems that all groups had the very valid points, both in terms of identifying challenges and needs for the training. And there are some common points, which, in my opinion, as far as I can identify, like there's a need for supporting the coordination at different levels, maybe starting from the regional to the local levels. And then when developing these training programs, of course, it is important to bring in the existing expertise, particularly from the outcomes of the projects funded by Biodiversa. And this way we can save some energy, some money, and also we do not basically have to reinvent the wheel again. And then the trainings obviously need to be more practical rather than being theoretical, and they can be directed towards not only a single stakeholder group, but they can be just specified, having different characters for to address the needs of the different stakeholders. But yes, the summary can be extended long, but I don't think that we need to do that, because we already did for each group. Then maybe we can move to the final section of today. I don't know if we can share the slides for clarifying our next steps. So as of today, we had this very fruitful workshop, the seminar. From now on, the team will work on drafting a concept note. So it will highly benefit from the inputs that you provide today, but we also need to do some, of course, like foresight exercises, maybe reading through the secondary resources, so that we want to develop a concept note to explore further what the objectives of training course will be. And then we at some point, if the need rises, if there's such request, and if we have the necessary resources, we may think about translating the training course materials, but I think it will be at a later stage. But these training courses will be enrolled in during 2023. This is our idea. And we will use this time, approximately 1 year ahead of us, for, again, developing the concept further. By April 2023, we would like to convene a bigger event. We call it as a policy forum meeting, where we bring together all the key actors that we communicate through this process. And then hopefully this trainings, as I said, will be performed and will be ended by September 2023. Then we would like to publish these training materials at the same time. So this is our roadmap that seems so far. And of course, you will be keep updated as the key contributors of this process. I think this is all with regards to the roadmap. And before, leaving the floor to Hilde, maybe for having the final words, I would like to thank you all for joining today. It was really a pleasure for us, and your contributions are really valuable. And of course, I would like to thank you, my colleagues at the coordination team, Cecile, Frederick, Hilde, Mariam. So thank you all for making this possible. And hopefully we will continue to work on it more effectively in the near future. So thank you so much. Hilde, please, if you'd like to say a few words.
Yeah, of course, also big thanks to you and also to Cecile and the other colleagues for shaping things up. Maybe just a few final remarks from the viewpoint of the coordination team, because together with Osman, we will have to get our heads around all the inputs that we received today. And so when it comes to the challenges, I think there were many things discussed and a lot of coherence between the different groups when it comes to better understanding of definitions, how to get this 30% or the 10% at the right places, how to make sure everything is effectively managed, political willingness that we have to overcome, stakeholder engagement. So I think there's a lot of things that we have identified. And then, of course, there were a lot of ideas proposed, and I think the challenge will now be to see how it relates to the different activities of Biodiversa Plus. I think a few elements have been proposed, which we can maybe, which will be more in relation to new research that we need. There are maybe a few elements that were proposed related more to creating more capacity for biodiversity monitoring activities and having more harmonization of monitoring schemes across Europe, whether it is to monitor actions or impact. I heard also a lot about success stories and about outreach and awareness raising, and we have also a separate stream of work in Biodiversa focusing specifically on that. I also heard a lot about connection with the international level, the IPES, and also the Convention on Biological Diversity. So again, there may be a few capacity building activities that we foresee in that stream of work. And also some work that we will do on national hubs. One of the things that we aim to do is to see what type of national hubs we have in the different countries, what are the objectives of these hubs, and how could we then use these hubs also to roll out, for example, these training courses. So just to say that there are a lot of ideas that we see here that could also feed other activities, but then specifically for science-based policy support and the forum that we foresee. I think there were some very good ideas proposed. We heard from the different groups that some training materials are already available. So most likely we do not need to start from scratch. But the added value of Biodiversa will be that we bring it back to the national level, because we are a network of national ministries, agencies, after all. So that's a great added value that we have. And we could supplement these training courses, bringing in also the scientists. We could try to find a way to roll out the training courses by also engaging with our scientific community, because that could also help to make these training materials less theoretical and really make it tangible in terms of solutions. I also like this idea of some innovative tools like the games. I think it would be nice if we reflect a bit on that, of how we could make the training courses also, a bit innovative. And maybe the last thing to say is that we will also have to reflect a bit on when we have identified a topic for the training course and we want to roll it out in the countries, indeed, how to make it happen. So most likely we will have to work through the national hubs. We may have to find a few champions in the countries that are willing to follow some training. So we will also have to work out the practicalities of rolling things out at the national level. But with all the good ideas that we received today, I'm sure that we will manage. But I think it was great, and great thanks again to Osman for his perseverance in bringing all these ideas also together, and Cecile in this very nice workshop. So thank you to all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ile. I think, it's up to me to close the meeting finally. But I wish you all a wonderful weekend, a relaxing weekend. And thank you once again for all these valuable contributions. You will definitely hear more from us, and we will do this together with your support. And much appreciated. Thank you so much.